Over 4 years, between 1967 and 1971, Shaw Brothers director Zhang Che made 3 films about one-armed swordsmen. The first 2 starring Wang Yu, also later known as Jimmy Wang Yu, and the third starring David Chiang, who was one of Zhang Che's own kind of discoveries, or brought up through the studio system by Zhang Che. Let's start in 1967 with the original One-Armed Swordsman. This was Zhang Che's 4th vehicle for the former swimming star Wang Yu, who was born in China, in South China, and had come to Hong Kong at some point in his early teens or mid-teens, and had been groomed by the company as a potential action star. It hadn't really happened yet, although he'd been the lead in quite a number of films. At that point, Zhang Che had been so-called planning producer on those films, so he had some involvement with them already. But Zhang Che was quite keen at this point, having written mostly melodramas. He'd been taken on as a screenwriter originally, looking for opportunities to direct. In the 60s, he was still very much a romance director, and that's even true of all 3 films in this trilogy. He gets to finally make a low-budget film, direct a low-budget film himself with Wang Yu, and it's a film called Tiger Boy, which I've never seen, and neither have you, because it's not part of the Celestial Pictures restoration project to bring back the Shaw's back catalogue. After that, Zhang Che became a regular director of Wang Yu's films. He basically taking over from Xu Chenghong. And this was, as I said before, their 4th film together, the 4th time that Zhang Che directed Wang Yu in a film. Where did he get the idea of making Wang Yu a disabled hero, a one-armed swordsman? Well, I think there are several sources for this. The first thing is that Wang Yu, by this early stage in his career, had already established a very strong masochistic principle that he loved to be beaten up and handicapped on screen. That may have been one of the origins of this. By this time, Zhang Che was, although he, I think, never stopped working on scripts, he was beginning a very long collaborative process. When I say very long, it stretched through many, many years and literally almost countless films, with a Hong Kong pulp writer called Ni Guang. Ni Guang did all kinds of things. He did lots of martial arts fiction, but he did science fiction, he did fantasy, he did some romance, although with certain dark twists in it. And was an incredibly prolific Hong Kong pulp writer. He was also, by all accounts, a quite literate man and quite well-educated man, and rather personable and enjoyable. But his principle always was to, when approached by a film company, and that was most often Shaw Brothers, to write a script, he said, okay, give me the source material or the story that you want covered. And he would go away for 4 days, come back with what he called a script, which I think most of us with any knowledge of filmmaking would call a script outline. I mean, more like a scene breakdown of the film, not necessarily with all that much dialogue in it, sometimes with, sometimes without. Famously, he insisted on being paid up front, so that before he wrote a word, he wanted the payment for it. And also, under no circumstances would he accept it back for rewrites. If anybody had second thoughts about anything, tough, but he wasn't going to be the one who did it. So, but people were happy with this, and if you watch particularly wuxia films or kung fu films later, you will find Ni Guang's name on many, many, many script credits. Not only at Shaw Brothers, mostly at Shaw Brothers, but not exclusively. The other primary source for this is a Japanese one. In 1962, about 5 years before this film was made, the Daiei company in Japan had begun making a series of films starring Katsu Shintaro called the Zatoichi series. Zatoichi, as you may know, is a blind swordsman. This series was immensely popular in Japan. It was also immensely popular in Hong Kong, and I think may have been the origin of the idea that a disabled hero might be a very interesting figure for audiences to connect with. You know, after this so-called trilogy was finished and Wang Yu had left Shaw Brothers, the very first film he made for their rivals Golden Harvest, outside Hong Kong, because Shaw Brothers produced an injunction to stop him ever filming in Hong Kong again as a punishment for walking out on their contract, was a film shot partly in Japan, partly in Taiwan, I believe. Brought back his original Shaw Brothers director, Xu Tsung-hong, called Zatoichi Meets the One-Armed Swordsman, 1971. We should note that martial arts fiction in China has a history. It first flourished in the early Republican period in the 1920s, when a lot of martial arts stories, Jianghu stories, so-called Jianghu means rivers and lakes, and it conjures up an alternative universe, if you like, where knights errant, basically people with great martial prowess, adventure through the landscape of China. It became a very popular genre in the late 20s and inevitably started inspiring films. The films were not so exciting, although the most successful one, The Burning of the Red Lotus Monastery, ran to nearly 20 sequels, so it must have done quite well. The nationalist government, as it assumed some kind of unified control over China, beating off various regional warlords, decided to take the precaution of banning the genre. So it kind of disappeared from both newspapers in which it had been serialized and from cinema screens, but reappeared in Hong Kong, which was of course free of government control at that time. And so already in the late 1940s, very soon after the Japanese were defeated and retreated from Hong Kong, the genre is there in Cantonese cinema. And it produced most famously the Wong Fei Hung series, which was very protracted and has still now never completely gone away. Anyhow, these films got made and they saw a resurgence of martial arts fiction in Hong Kong newspapers. The genre threw up one master in Hong Kong by the name of Jin Yong. At least that was his pen name. His more common name was Louis Cha, and he was the founder editor of Hong Kong's best newspaper, Ming Bao, also known as Ming Po in Cantonese. He published, I think, 15 famous martial arts novels which have been endlessly adapted for television and for the big screen. And one of his books, known in English I think as Return of the Condor Heroes, has a scene in which a woman unhappy with her man severs his arm. And that, I believe, was the direct inspiration for the motif in this film. So we have a number of things. We have Wang Yu's masochism, we have the Zatoichi influence from Japan, very popular in Hong Kong, and we have this motif from a Jin Yong novel published at the beginning of the decade. Jiang Shi himself, who published a lengthy memoir, here it is, translated into English, published by the Hong Kong Film Archive, is rather dismissive about the film. He doesn't rate it very highly himself, and he thinks he went much better, did much better work on the second two films in the trilogy, and of course in later films too, other later films too. But whatever the director himself thought of it, the film was a huge success. It was popularly believed to be the first film in Hong Kong to gross $1 million Hong Kong. This was way, way above average grosses for Hong Kong films in Hong Kong at the time. In the 1950s, 1960s, one of the factors holding back the Hong Kong film industry was the great popularity of foreign import films in the circuits of Hong Kong. And people, it was in those days very cheap to go to the movies. Cinemas were amongst the first public places in Hong Kong to get air conditioning. And since Hong Kong is hot and humid for much of the year, a lot of people were very, very happy to go and spend their time in the movies in air conditioning and enjoying the films on offer. And this is also, as it happens, the years before broadcast television became a big thing in Hong Kong. We have here a situation where Mandarin cinema has been present since the late 40s in Hong Kong, despite the fact that Hong Kong itself is basically Cantonese speaking. And anybody who comes and settles in Hong Kong pretty much has to learn Cantonese if they're going to survive in Hong Kong society. There had been a Mandarin film industry, as I said, despite the presence of an overwhelmingly Cantonese-speaking population in Hong Kong, because there were so many emigres from the communist victory in the Civil War in China in the 40s, and a lot of people, including film industry personnel, had moved to Hong Kong. Anyhow, in this circumstance, it was quite hard for Hong Kong cinema to get itself well established commercially in the 50s and 60s, because foreign movies did so well. And I think the all-time record holder in Hong Kong until about 67, 68 was a film called The Sound of Music, directed by Robert Wise, which had been an enormous success, both in Hong Kong and around the region in Southeast and Southeast Asia. That record was swept away by a King Hu film called Dragon Gate Inn, which famously became the highest grossing Chinese language picture ever at that point. Meanwhile, Zhang Che had already broken a local record in Hong Kong with One-Armed Swordsman, which, as I said before, was reputed to be the first film in Hong Kong to gross over $1 million Hong Kong dollars at the box office. Zhang Che himself was not so proud of this, but the fact that the film was so successful and that Wang Yu went on to have even more success. Well, Wang Yu was made to be an absolute top star by this film. The public couldn't get enough of him after One-Armed Swordsman. And one of the first things they saw him in after One-Armed Swordsman was a film called Golden Swallow, also directed by Zhang Che, also co-written by Ni Guang, also a heterosexual romance, in fact a romantic triangle picture. That was also an enormous success. It was notionally a sequel to the film that King Hu made before, also walking out of Shaw Brothers, a film called Come Drink With Me. That had been very successful too, and led probably inevitably to the sequel to One-Armed Swordsman called Return of the One-Armed Swordsman, made 2 years later in 1969. One crucial thing had happened in the intervening year. Martial arts choreographers had become a real thing at Shaw Brothers, and in fact soon afterwards throughout the industry. You'll notice that on One-Armed Swordsman there is no credit for action choreography. In the mid-60s, Lau Ka Leung and his partner, regular collaborator Tong Kai, they had run away from the Cantonese film industry into the Mandarin film industry, but they'd fetched up not at Shaw Brothers initially, but at a left-wing Mandarin company where they had worked on a film called The Jade Bow, which had also been a big success, probably the biggest success for that company to that point. But they were lured away to Shaw Brothers. Shaw Brothers, of course, noticed the big success and immediately came to them with offers of money and resources which were not available at the left-wing company, and so they went over. In Return of the One-Armed Swordsman, absolutely they get credit for their action choreography. They do for quite a few years to come, working on virtually all of Zhang Che's films. There's a break which occurs in Taiwan, I think in 1974, when there's a disagreement. Lau Ka Leung comes back to Hong Kong and becomes a director himself in 75. And becomes, I think it's fair to say, a much greater director than Zhang Che. He has a strong influence on Zhang Che eventually, particularly in the early 70s, guiding him towards more realistic, authentic, skills-based martial arts stories, and casting actors who have genuine competence in the martial arts. But Wong Yu's feats were mostly very much special effects assisted, and that's absolutely the case with Return of the One-Armed Swordsman. The film is a direct sequel to the first one, in that it picks up exactly where the first one left off. He was rescued from his dismemberment by a fisherman's daughter by falling into her boat as it passed along a little river or stream under the bridge that he happened to be on at the time. And she had also introduced the motif of the half-missing martial arts manual. But this is a manual that has been set fire to at some point, and half of it is missing, burned away. That becomes a recurrent motif in later martial arts films as well. So he, having recovered from his grievous injury, is pacifist, is avoiding violence, is trying to lead a normal life, trying to reinvent himself as a peasant farmer in blissful heterosexual partnership with his beloved wife, who saved his life, only to find himself inexorably drawn back into the melee of the martial arts world. Actually, Ni Kuang apparently didn't work on this script, didn't come up with the 4-page, 4-day outline. Zhang She takes credit for it himself, and he seems to have set it up as a tournament-type film. It's like the kind of thing that Bruce Lee did a bit later with Game of Death. The hero will be pitched against multiple opponents, each with his own distinctive fighting style and his own distinctive weaponry. So our hero, Fan Gang, played by Wang Yu, is eventually drawn into a tournament. The bad guys have decided to wipe out their rivals by calling a fake competition at their headquarters to try and get rid of any potential opposition in the region so that they can rule their neck of the Jianghu themselves. Fan Gang is reluctant to join this, of course, because of his newfound pacifism, but is eventually, through circumstances, as you will see, prevailed upon to join in and to take action. Now, as we've noted earlier, Lau Ka-leung had appeared on the scene in Golden Swallow, together with his regular collaborator Tong Kai, and they also at this stage were not dedicated to realistic martial arts. That only comes up really in the early 70s, 73, 74, around that time. Hence special effects. Lots of wire work, lots of magical flying through the air, weightless martial arts, combats that take place in midair, and lots of exotic weaponry, some of which is based on reality, some of which is not based on reality, but invented by them, I guess, or taken from martial arts novels, martial arts fiction. They equip themselves quite well in this film. The fight scenes are markedly more spectacular, markedly more inventive, and markedly more dynamic than they are in the first One-Armed Swordsman. I think this is the moment to turn to what Zhang She himself had to say about this. "I'd been troubled," he said, "by the conservative style of my cinematographer until the shooting of One-Armed Swordsman, when I thought of experimenting with handheld camera. I foresaw that it would be hard to gain the cooperation of my cameraman, and instead promoted an assistant, Kwong Han Le, to take charge of this photography. The team worked smoothly." If you look at the film, the original One-Armed Swordsman, you'll see there is a scattering of handheld shots through the film. It's not a big deal in the film, but there are certain points when, probably for speed, partly to give it a slightly more dynamic effect on the viewer, Zhang She uses handheld shots, and it does seem to be the first time in Shaw Brothers' practice at the studio that had been done. So he does have a claim to have innovated there. He goes on to talk about the success of the film and about the follow-up, his next film, The Eighth, which is called The Assassin, another vehicle for Wang Yu. He said, "I earned the title Million Dollar Director due to the success of One-Armed Swordsman. Was it the first film in Hong Kong film history to reach the $1 million mark? I don't know for sure. I was indeed the first director to keep making films that sustained that record for a good period of time until inflation and higher standards of living nullified the record. The record boosted my confidence and fueled my ambition. Although One-Armed Swordsman was the cornerstone of my directing career, it was a hackneyed work, except for the breakthrough achieved in pace and motion. Not content with the commercial path One-Armed Swordsman was going down, I strived to elevate the artistic values of my later films. One-Armed Swordsman was my new endeavour to shoot a film set against a historical background of ancient China, to explore the state of mind of young warriors who risked their lives in pursuit of personal glory and passion. The film includes adult scenes rarely seen at the time. But in The Assassin, the film sacrificed its entertaining values for money. Money would translate literally as boring art. I crossed the definitive line between literary and action dramas and deliberately imitated the camera work of Fei Mu's wartime film Confucius, made in 1940 in Shanghai, shooting the entire film from a low angle with a static 40mm lens. A sharp contrast to the style of One-Armed Swordsman, it was slowly paced with little camera movement. Netting over $1 million from The Assassin was just unimaginable. The only sequence displaying my dynamic action design was the closing scene. It was pure luck that the film wasn't a commercial disaster. Apart from the fact that it rode the crest of the One-Armed Swordsman wave, all I can say is I was in luck. It's rather odd that he doesn't have anything much to say about the actual content of One-Armed Swordsman or its sequel. He does dismiss the sequel as well a bit later on, a page further on, when he says that the film was simply recycling previous films. I think that's true to some degree, but it is a marked step forward aesthetically from the first film, because it's much more ambitious, much more dynamic, and has a lot more fighting in it. Clearly, the presence of Lau Kar Leung and Tong Kai as choreographers on the film has a major bearing on this. I think Zhang Che is beginning to realise that martial arts spectacle, set-piece action scenes are going to become crucial in putting this genre across to the audience, as I think they still are today. Now, we noted earlier that Wang Yu walked away from his Shaw Brothers contract. He directed his first film in 1970, and it was called The Chinese Boxer. He walks out after making this film, The Chinese Boxer. Shaw immediately takes out an injunction preventing him from filming in Hong Kong, which lasted until his death in 2022. He did visit Hong Kong a few times, notably for Zhang Che's funeral. He never made a film in Hong Kong again, or never took part in any filming in Hong Kong again. But his departure coincided with the departure of Run Run Shaw's right-hand man, Raymond Chow, who walked out and formed a company called Golden Harvest, based on the ruins of the old Cathay Company, which had been the major rival to Shaw Brothers in the earlier 60s. He took with him a number of talents from Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong, and if you look at the first year's slate at Golden Harvest, it is indistinguishable from Shaw Brothers. It's the same kind of film, the same scripts, the same writers and directors, the same actors in many cases. It's a clone of Shaw Brothers. That doesn't really change until Bruce Lee comes back to Hong Kong from the United States and ends up doing a two-picture deal with Raymond Chow at Golden Harvest, having rejected a multi-picture deal for no money with Run Run Shaw. So we have the situation that Golden Harvest finds itself suddenly rocketing into the big time thanks to Bruce Lee. And that sets a pattern which encourages other big names in Hong Kong cinema, including King Hu, including the comedian director Michael Hui, including Sammo Hung and other martial arts luminaries, to start their own companies under the Golden Harvest umbrella and to start producing their own films with financing from Golden Harvest. Wang Yu's first film, having left Hong Kong and relocated to Taiwan, was Zatoichi Meets the One-Armed Swordsman, bringing back probably his most famous character, the character that made him a star in Hong Kong, and confronting him with one of his prototypes. 1 year after that, in 1972, one of his next films for Golden Harvest was a film called One-Armed Boxer, which took exactly the same formula but made him an unarmed combat hero rather than a swordplay hero. In the absence of Wang Yu from the Shaw Brothers lot, but the presence of Wang Yu on cinema screens in Hong Kong still, just not in Shaw Brothers films anymore, Shaw and Zhang Che wanted to fight back. Zhang Che had been bringing up two young actors. One was a young man called Tam Wing at that time, who does appear in Return of the One-Armed Swordsman in a small role, a bit part. He's nowadays much better known as Di Long, who became, of course, one of the mainstays of Shaw Brothers in the 1970s, and subsequently after Shaw Brothers in films like A Better Tomorrow for John Woo. The other was known at the time as David Chiang, Jiang Da Wei. Da Wei is in fact an approximation of David, so it was logical enough that he would be called David Chiang. Perversely, when he left Shaw Brothers in the mid-80s, when Shaw's effectively closed down regular production, he decided to rename himself John Chiang. So his subsequent films for other companies like D&B and others bill him as John Chiang, while still calling him Jiang Da Wei in Chinese. I think it's a way of symbolically distancing himself from the many years of being a faithful servant to Shaw Brothers, which he didn't feel, I think, he benefited from all that much. By 1971, when the new One-Armed Swordsman was made, he had asserted himself, and he, I think it's fair to say, is a more interesting actor than Wang Yu. Wang Yu was notable first for his masochism, but second for a sort of Buster Keaton-like inflexibility of facial expressions. Just as Buster Keaton was a kind of poker face in his comedies, so Wang Yu was a kind of poker face in his wuxia films. The difference with David Chiang is rather considerable, because David Chiang is a very interiorized actor. He clearly has an inner life. You see his face, you can see him thinking, which is not usually the case with Wang Yu. He is given a rather different situation to make him one-armed, whereas Wang Yu loses an arm because a woman whom he has shown no interest in resents him and chops off his arm in an ambush, actually. It's, of course, a symbolic castration. You don't have to be a dyed-in-the-wool Freudian to understand that this is a kind of castration. And when he learns to fight with his left arm only and to become an expert swordsman with just one arm, that's his triumph. But Wang Yu's Fang Gang in the first two films is basically a victim figure. He becomes a class victim, essentially. And this is what renders him vulnerable to losing his arm. That's not true of the David Chiang character, Lei Li, in the third film. Lei Li is seen under the credits at the beginning of the film as an arrogant hero at large. We see him ambushing a number of other people, all on horseback. However, he is targeted by the character played in this film, again by Gu Feng. He challenges Lei Li to a duel. He wins it relatively easily, and the forfeit that Lei Li has previously agreed to is that he will sever his own arm as punishment and retire from the Jianghu, from the martial world. All of which happens. That's what he does precisely. We next see him, minus his right arm, working in a humble rural restaurant where he's doing work in the kitchen, working the tables, serving at the tables, and is looked after by his master, who is a nice, decent guy, it seems. The local blacksmith's daughter has a crush on him, giving him his heterosexual interest. However, it must be said that he became his morose and inward-looking, largely taciturn, until Di Long shows up as a roving knight from the Jianghu. He watches over him, helps in various ways, rescues the girl when she gets carried away by the bad guys. Suddenly, Lei Li comes to life. It has to be said, it's overtly homoerotic. The buddyship between the two boys vastly trumps the heterosexual relationship with the girl. The film does end up with Lei Li back in the arms of his wife. She is a wife by that time and is pregnant by that time. I don't think anything we see between the two of them, the husband and wife couple, matches the intensity, the warmth, the enthusiasm, the brio, the kind of virile enthusiasm of the relationship between Lei Li and Feng, who is the swordsman played by Di Long. And it sets a template for many, many other Zhang Che films of the early 70s. Shaws were by this time encouraged by the great success of the wuxia genre, the fact that the wuxia was rapidly becoming their main genre. And in fact, if you look ahead to 72, Zhang Che is credited on a film a month. He didn't direct all of these films. He allegedly supervised them or co-directed them, but other Shaw Brothers in-house directors actually had to do the donkey work. It was easily the dominant genre, spurred on not only by the success of Zhang Che's previous films, but also by the huge success of Bruce Lee at Golden Harvest. Suddenly Shaws felt an imperative to make kung fu and wuxia films to keep their place in the market, keep their dominance in the market, which to a large extent they succeeded in doing. The first big international success was a film made by a Korean director they were employing at the time, called King Boxer, starring Law Lear. And Law Lear, the story has him becoming handicapped, disabled. His hands are targeted and he has to train himself back into full use of his hands so that he can fight back in unarmed combat. It becomes a recurrent motif in the martial arts films of the early 70s. And beyond, of course, in subsequent years too. Shaws were fortified by this surge in popularity for the genre and the fact that they had Zhang Che under contract and perceived at that point to be one of the leading practitioners in the genre, not least because of unwavering support from Lau Kar Leung and Tong Kai as his martial arts choreographers. So Shaws, who'd had Shaw's Movie Town, they had 8 stages at the studio, plus a processing lab, plus printing facilities, design facilities, costume stores, prop stores, everything you could want to do every period of Chinese history. It was a self-sufficient studio. They also contained dormitories where many of the key personnel lived. So the whole thing was substantially self-contained. But now suddenly things were really taking off by the end of the 1960s, thanks mostly to martial arts and wuxia films. And so Shaws decided to splash out on buying a new adjacent plot of land. This is in the area of Hong Kong, if you look at a map you'll see it, called Clearwater Bay, because there is an inlet of the sea just behind the land where Movie Town was built, and that was the land that Shaw bought for development. They then spent almost as much again on building a huge outdoor set on it, with the sea in the background. This set is for something that is called Fierce Tiger Fortress in the film, dominated by Fierce Tiger Mansion, which is where the tournament is set to take place in the story of the film. And boy, is it shown off a lot. Zhang Che follows orders and displays this lavish outdoor set, including a very long wooden bridge which leads to the mansion across, I suppose it's swampland. We don't really see what it is, but anyway, it's raised and takes us to the front entrance of the mansion. And it's where the final great duel of the film is set, famously. This outdoor set, with minor variations and changes and some other modifications, turns up again and again in later films. This is maybe the first time you see it, it's certainly not the last time you see it. Overall, though, I think the film is quite a bit more sophisticated than the first two One-Armed Swordsman films, partly because of the central performance by David Chiang, who is clearly an actor of some substance and able to give at least hints of depth to the character. And second, because everybody involved, including the choreographers Lau Kar-leung and Tong Kai, are becoming more confident in what they're doing by this point. As the genre takes off and hits the big time, and it's no longer just one of the genres in Chinese cinema, but becomes the dominant genre in Hong Kong cinema, these guys begin to get some sense of what they might be doing. So I think the foundations of authentic skills, martial skills, are being laid at this point. And you will see that compared with the special effects tournament stuff in Return of the One-Armed Swordsman, the fighting here it's still very much special effects assisted. Most of it is not at all realistic, but more of it hinges on the reality of the actors' real-life skills. There was a poll some years ago of Hong Kong film people and critics and practitioners, producers, all kinds of people, to establish a list of the 100 best Chinese films of all time, Chinese language films of all time. And the original One-Armed Swordsman appeared on this list, not near the top, but on it in the top 100. Personally, I would say that new One-Armed Swordsman, made 4 years after the first one, is a considerably better film than the first one. But you have to admit that the reason people retain a great affection for the first one is that it was so seminal. It took the genre into a new dimension in Hong Kong and made a lot of subsequent things possible. So it remains a very important film, even if it was superseded by its own sequels.